All right, so here we go with evolution part 2, some terms to know. There we go. All right, mass extinction versus background extinction. All right, so background extinction rate is the normal rate of extinction that species go through. Species will go extinct at a low level all the time. Now, the key here is low level. These low level extinctions are due to changing environmental conditions, they're due to competition. Some species just cannot survive. There are a number of reasons why species would go extinct. A mass extinction is a widespread event that wipes out the majority, over 50% of living plants and animals. Now, we have had 5 mass extinctions so far. The one that you guys are probably the most familiar with is the dinosaurs. And some argue that we are now going through the 6th mass extinction due to humans. So, and that's because of things like habitat destruction, changing temperatures in some areas, irrigation in some areas, causing desertification in others. So there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing animals die at a higher rate right now. And a mass extinction is any widespread event over 50% of living plants and animals. So we may be going through the 6th mass extinction, we may not. It will just depend over time how many of these animals live or die. And these extinctions happen at a geologic timescale. So this is not something that you can see like in your lifetime. This is something that happens over the course of thousands of years and tens of thousands of years and millions of years. You should also understand the difference between the terms microevolution versus macroevolution as you're reading your textbook, as you're going through labs, as you're going through these notes even. These two terms will come up. Both of these happen in the same way. Both happen for the same reason. We use different terms only to describe these different situations because they're descriptive. Microevolution means a small scale change seen over a shorter time period. We will talk about microevolution in like an activity where you'll look at like small changes that are happening over relatively short time spans, maybe hundreds or 1,000 years. Macroevolution are large scale changes that give rise to new species. And so these will occur over, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Microevolution, it could be anything over a couple of days if we're talking about an organism that has a very short lifespan, or it could be, longer depending on what kind of organism we're talking about. So we'll use both of those terms, but they happen the same way. It's just whether the changes are small or whether they're large. All right, evolution and natural selection. A lot of times these things are used interchangeably, but there's some slight differences, some understanding that we need to make sure you guys have. Evolution is when modern organisms descend from ancient organisms with modification. So modification, that means minor changes. So that means some small changes. Changes caused by speciation events and natural selection are going to be passed down. Natural selection is the process in which organisms with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than organisms with other characteristics. This is where we get unequal reproductive success. And we'll talk about what unequal reproductive success means and how these things are passed down. But the key for the definition of natural selection is that it is the process. So it is the process by which these characteristics are more likely to get passed on through generations. It is one of the basic mechanisms of evolution. Other mechanisms of evolution that we'll talk about, some are going to be mutation, migration, and genetic drift. Natural selection, though, is one that we're going to kind of start with because that's one that is important to make sure you understand. All right, the process of natural selection. There are 4 main parts. So these are 4 requirements you need in order for natural selection to happen. You have to have variation. So this means individual variation in appearance or behavior. So this would be, fish that are either striped or not. That would be your variation. You have at least 2 different phenotypes, 2 different physical appearances. This trait has to be heritable. It has to be consistently passed on. That means we see this pattern from parents to offspring. So this was the reason we did genetics. We talked about genetics, like that is our inheritance. So the trait has to be able to be passed down. Some things are very easy to see how they're passed down. Those are things that are controlled by like one gene, things that we talked about like flower color. Some things are going to be harder to be passed down, and so they might not experience the same amount of selection because they're not passed down as much, or passed down as consistently. So those might include things that require multiple genes, things like height, because there's so many genes involved that it's not quite as certain that if you have like a tall parent, you will get a tall child. The next is high rate of population growth. What this means is that you have to have more offspring each year than the local resources can support. So, you know, you have, I don't know, a bunch of these little offspring that are just circles, and this is too many because they have to eat, I don't know, these triangles up here. And there are only 4 triangles for them to eat. But here we have 7 of the circles, so some of them are just not going to make it. They don't have the right kind of appearance or the right kind of behavior in order to survive that struggle for the scarce resources. That is where we get to our differential survival. So these ones showed differential survival. They survived, and therefore they can contribute more offspring to the next generation. This is key. This is so important. They have to pass those genes on in order for natural selection to take place. If these little circle organism guys are the ones that can fight and get the triangles the best, but they can't pass their genes on, those genes will not go to the next generation. So you have to have both parts. You have to have them be well suited for struggling for those limited resources so that they can survive, and also to pass the genes on. All right, here's a great example of these 4 things. So first we have variation. We've got our dark colored lions and our light colored lions. There's competition between the 2 lions over the food. The lions that blend in, so the light colored lions that blend in with this lighter yellow grass, can catch their prey easier because they aren't seen. So they have a better chance of surviving. Here we have 100 years later, the darker lions, we see very few of them, and eventually they die off because it was harder for them to catch prey. The lighter lions survived, and they also passed on that light colored gene to their offspring. This light color is the adaptation. They are more adapted to the environment, and therefore they are more fit. So this is where we get that survival of the fittest. So I know you guys have seen that and heard of that before. Oh. So this is survival of the fittest. All right. So to kind of sum it up, from one generation to the next, the struggle for resources, what Darwin called the struggle for existence, will favor individuals with some variations over others and thereby change the frequency of traits within the population. This process is called natural selection. The traits that confer an advantage to those individuals who leave more offspring are called adaptations. So this is just kind of rephrasing what we've already talked about. That whole process we went over is natural selection. So the process is the natural selection. And the advantageous traits, those are our adaptations. So just a little bit more of that vocab. All right, we're going to talk about the history. I know I mentioned Darwin. You have probably heard his name before. He is kind of the big name we know of when we talk about the history of evolution, but there are some other scientists and some other ideas we're going to talk about, but that will be in our next video. So if you're finishing this one, you're done with this video, and then you'll move on to the history of evolution video next.